here. Mr. Jim Cunningham.
Question number 2, Mr. Speaker.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure that the whole House and the whole country will join with me in condemning the sickening and brutal murder of another American hostage and share our shock and anger that it again appears to have been carried out by a British citizen. All our thoughts are with the British hostage and his family. Their ordeal is unimaginable. But let me be very clear, this country will never give in to terrorism. Our opposition to ISIL will continue at home and abroad. It is important that we are clear about the nature of the threat we are facing. It makes no distinction between cultures, countries and religions. There is no way to appease it. The only way to defeat it is to stand firm and to send a very straightforward message. A country like ours will not be cowed by these barbaric killers. If they think that we will weaken in the face of their threats, they are wrong. It will have the opposite effect. We will be more forthright in the defence of the values, liberty under the rule of law, freedom, democracy that we hold dear. And I'm sure a united message to that effect will go forward from this House today. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Mr. Jim Cunningham.
Mr. Speaker, can I endorse what the Prime Minister just said about the American hostage? Can I say to the Prime Minister, when some years ago, he said he wanted to stop the Conservatives banging on about Europe, what has happened?
Well, a lot of things have changed in Europe, not least the Eurozone crisis, which had eased but is beginning to reappear. And this has created an enormous tension within the European Union, those countries within the Eurozone that need further integration, and those countries outside the Eurozone that want to have a more flexible relationship with Europe. And it's absolutely right we debate and discuss these matters in this House, but above all, it is right we include the British people, and under my plans, they will have the decisive say before the end of 2017.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister join me in congratulating all the businesses in Basildon and Thurrock who have, over the last year, reduced unemployment by 36% in my constituency? And does he agree with me that this is evidence that our long-term economic plan is working?
Well, I'm delighted to join my honourable friend in that way. Unemployment is coming down right across the country. In the east of England, the number of people in work is up by 400,000 since the election. Private sector employment is up, the number of businesses is up, the investment is up. And the news today we have about the GDP figure revisions shows that since 2010, this country has grown faster than France, faster than Germany, faster than any major economy apart from Canada and the United States of America. There shouldn't be any complacency because the job is not yet done, but our long-term economic plan is working, and it is the way to secure a better future for our country.
Mr. Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, I join the Prime Minister in expressing the universal sense of revulsion at the barbaric murder of Stephen Sotloff and in expressing deep concern about the British hostage being held. This will be a terrible time for his family, and people across the country will be thinking of them. And, Mr. Speaker, this is a pattern of murderous behaviour by ISIL of the innocent. Christians, Yazidis, Muslims, anyone who does not agree with their vile ideology. And I agree with what the Prime Minister says. Events like this must strengthen, not weaken, our resolve to defeat them, and he can be assured of our full support in standing firm against them.
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank the Leader of the Opposition for what he has said and the way in which he said it. I think this House should send a united message. I think what has happened to the two hostages so far and what may happen again in the future is utterly abhorrent and barbaric. And these people need to understand we will not waver in our aim of defeating terrorism. And that is not something that divides this House politically. It is something that everyone, and I suspect the entirety of our country, agrees with.
Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, ISIL's pattern of killing will shock people not just in Britain but across the world. Does he further agree with me that we and countries in the region have a vital humanitarian and security interest in overcoming ISIL? And can I ask him what progress is being made to mobilise other countries, including Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and regional bodies, especially the Arab League, against ISIL?
Well, I think, if I might say, the way the Leader of the Opposition is approaching this is entirely right. We should see this crisis as one where we are there to help the people on the ground and the countries in the region that want to solve this crisis. We should not see this as one where it is somehow a Western-led intervention. We have the Kurds that are defending communities, including minority communities, from the horrors of ISIL. We have the government in Baghdad, which badly needs to get itself together so it can represent all of the country. And then we, with allies and neighbours, can do more to make sure that this appalling organisation, ISIL, feels the full pressure of international and regional and local condemnation. That is what should be done. As he says, we should be using all the assets that we have, focusing first on humanitarian aid and saving people from persecution, hunger and starvation, using our diplomatic and political pressures to make sure there is a government in Baghdad that can represent all the country, and marshalling, working with others so the maximum amount of pressure is put on. And I think if we continue in that way, always asking ourselves, how can others in the neighbourhood do their work? How can we help them? And how do we best defend our national interest and keep our people safe at home? That is the right approach.
Mr. Ed Miliband.
Speaker, I agree with the Prime Minister in building that partnership is vital in the weeks and months ahead, and work through the UN is obviously a key part of building the legitimacy and effectiveness of the alliance against ISIL. In addition to the UN Security Council resolution passed in the last few weeks, can he tell us what plans he has to use the UK's chair of the Security Council to build that international consensus that he talked about?
Well, so far, as he says, we have used the United Nations to put pressure on ISIL by making clear that people should not be providing resources or sanctuary to these people. Indeed, they should be cut off. That has been the approach so far. But we do have an opportunity through the UN to marshal international support and backing for the view that this ISIL so-called Islamic Caliphate is unacceptable and needs to be squeezed out of existence. That is what we should do, and we should aim to get the maximum support through the UN for the measures right across the board that are being taken.
Mr. Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, turning to the threat we face in Britain, people will have been shocked and disgusted that there were British voices on the video and that British citizens are part of ISIL. On Monday, the Prime Minister announced that he would reintroduce relocation powers for suspected terrorists. He has our full support for this change. Can he confirm that this will go ahead, and can he give an indication of the timetable for bringing these powers forward?
I can confirm it will go ahead, and it is going to require legislation. And the key is, I think, to put the desires and advice of David Anderson, who is the independent reviewer of terrorism, to put those into action. What he's spoken about is some combination of exclusion and relocation. And it is that needs to be introduced into the terrorism prevention and investigatory measures. I think we should try to do this on a cross-party basis to send the clearest possible message, and I think that urgency is the order of the day.
Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, the best way to deal with terrorists is, of course, criminal prosecution, and where that is not possible, strict restrictions on their activities and movements. On Monday, he also proposed the possibility of blocking British citizens from returning to the UK. Given that there's been some doubt cast on this, can he say a bit more about whether he believes this is legally permissible, and again, whether there are plans to take this forward?
The short answer is I do believe it is legally permissible, but it's going to take some work for this reason. We already have the power when people are trying to return to the United Kingdom. If it is a foreign national, we can exclude them, even if they've lived in this country for any number of years. If it's a dual national, you can strip them of their British citizenship and exclude them from the country. If it's a naturalised Briton, you can, under our new laws passed recently through this House, you can strip them of their British nationality. But I do believe there is a gap where you have someone born, raised and a British citizen, rather like the individual we discussed on Monday from High Wycombe, saying he wanted to return in order to do harm to our country. Of course, the best thing to do is to gather evidence, prosecute, convict and imprison, but I believe there may be occasions when we need to exclude, and so therefore we should fill that gap in our armoury, and I believe it is legal and possible to do it.
Ed Miliband.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course we will look at the practicality and legality of any proposals he comes forward with. Finally, can I ask him to revisit the case for strengthening the PREVENT programme, both in terms of resources and community engagement? Because after all, Mr. Speaker, that is essential to stop people being indoctrinated into this poisonous ideology. Mr. Speaker, we do need swift action to build alliances across the world against ISIL, and strong and considered action here at home. It's what the world needs, It's what the British people expect, and in pursuing this course, he will have our full support.
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for his support. On the PREVENT programme, what we have done is try and divide up the different elements of it. There is one part which is about community cohesion, which is best led on by the Department of Culture, the Department of Communities and Local Government, and the other part best run by the Home Office through the PREVENT programme. That is what we've done. But what I think we need to be absolutely clear about is it's not enough to target those who preach violent extremism. We need to go after those that promote the extremist narrative and life view that gives the terrorists and the men of violence support for what they do. It's not unlike the Cold War, where we did not just pursue those who wanted to do us such harm. We also had to challenge all those who gave them succour. That is what we need to do in this struggle, which, as I have said, I think will last for decades, and we need to show resilience and, as he said, unity in pursuing it.
Andrew Lansley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In this Parliament, our coalition government has increased health spending in England by over £17 billion a year. As a direct consequence of that, the block grant to Scotland, which supports NHS funding in Scotland, has increased by £1.7 billion a year. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that this gives the lie to Alex Salmond's propaganda about the NHS?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right. Because of the decisions we took, long-term decisions after a careful assessment, to increase spending on the health service, that has given extra money for Scotland to spend on the NHS. So that gives the lie to one of Alex Salmond's claims. His second claim, that somehow a Westminster government could privatise parts of the NHS in Scotland, is complete and utter nonsense. The only person who could privatise parts of the NHS Scotland is Alex Salmond, and you can tell someone has lost the argument when they start making ludicrous ideas about what they'd do themselves.
Gary McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There have been worrying reports over the past week about a rise in malnutrition, the return of rickets and children going back to school hungry after the school holidays. Now, I know the government is rolling out free school meals, but that alone won't solve food poverty. When I've asked the Prime Minister about this before, I've really felt that he's not taking this seriously. Will he acknowledge that it's a real problem, it's actually a national scandal, and it's his job to do something about it?
Prime Minister.
Well, first of all, I think it is welcome that all infants will have free school meals as they go to school this week, and that will be welcome to many, many families up and down the country. And the evidence is that 99% of schools are providing those free school meals. But I have to say, look, the best way we can help people is get more people into work, and we are, and to make sure our economy continues to grow and make sure it delivers for hard-working people. Now, I know the Labour Party want to get this narrative up and running about inequality, but let me give them some statistics to show why it is not true. There are 300,000 fewer children in poverty than when Labour were in office. Inequality in our country has gone down and not up. One of the most serious causes of poverty, long-term youth unemployment, is now lower than when this government came to office. That is how we're changing people's lives and changing people's life chances.
Mr. Martin Orwood.
Does the Prime Minister agree that our friends in the Middle East who share a basic commitment to pluralism, democracy and peaceful change, from the Syrian National Coalition to Mahmoud Abbas in Palestine to the elected governments of Kurdistan and Libya and we hope Iraq, must by now be finding British support inconsistent, fragmented and unstrategic? And isn't it time for a more consistent strategy?
I'm afraid I don't agree at all with the honourable gentleman. I think actually this government has massively increased our engagement with Gulf and Middle Eastern states. Everybody knows that our view is a view in favour of democracy, of human rights, of the building blocks of democracy. We're not sort of naive interventionists who believe you can drop democracy out the back of an aeroplane. It needs to be built. They know that is our view, but we engage with all of those states in order to maximise not just our influence, but the chance of regional stability in that vital area.
Was Diane Abbott.
Does the Prime Minister share public concern that terrible abuse can happen to children? Most recently, the 1,400 sexually abused girls in Rotherham. Yet, directors of social services and other senior officers pay no penalty and often move on to even higher paid jobs. Surely, if the contracts of the people at the top mean they cannot be sacked in such circumstances, maybe the contracts need looking at.
No, I agree entirely with what the Honourable Lady has said. First of all, what we've seen in Rotherham is deeply shocking, and as I have said, I think it demonstrates a failure in the local government system there, in the Children's Services Department and in policing, and all those issues need to be addressed, which is why I've asked the Home Secretary to chair a group of ministers to look at how we learn the lessons even before we get our child abuse inquiry fully underway. But where I think the Honourable Lady is absolutely right is that local authorities, when they employ these people, should look carefully at their contracts and make sure that if people don't do the job properly, they can be removed. It's absolutely vital. You cannot police all of this from Whitehall. Local government has responsibility for the people it employs and should hold them to account.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I concur with the Prime Minister's earlier comments on this appalling barbaric behaviour and say we all stand right behind him? If net migration into the UK continues at its present level, we can fill a city this side of Leeds every 3 years. This is not only unsustainable, but potentially destabilising to the country. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the sooner we adopt a visa-only system for all foreign nationals, including those from the EU, allowing a sovereign parliament to decide who settles here, the better?
Well, first of all, can I thank my honourable friend for what he says about the stand we must all take against terror and terrorism and ISIL. On the issue of immigration, we have done a huge amount to restrict migration from outside the European Union, and the figures are down by almost 30% since this government came to office. We've closed down 700 bogus colleges. We've introduced an economic limit. But I agree with him, we need to do more. Now, of course, the freedom of movement is an important principle, but it is not an unqualified right, and it should not be the freedom of movement to claim benefits. And we should also make sure when new member states join the European Union, we don't necessarily have transitional controls that simply last for a number of years. We have transitional controls that make sure they will not have full access to our markets until their economies are of a radically different size and shape.
Mr. Angus Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The most recent UK ambassador to NATO, Dame Marriott Leslie, has today said that an independent Scotland would be welcome in NATO, and that she is voting yes in the referendum, just like so many other undecided voters who want a better Scotland. Earlier this year, the Prime Minister gave a commitment on Scottish television to take part in a programme with undecided voters before the referendum. Will he be doing that or running away, just as he ran away from the First Minister in a debate?
On the television programme on Scottish television, I offered them a date and indeed a format, but they seem to run away themselves, which is a great pity. On NATO, I prefer to listen to Lord Robertson, the Secretary-General of NATO, who's absolutely clear that Scotland will be better off inside the United Kingdom and the United Kingdom will be better off with Scotland. And the problem with the right honourable gentleman is when it comes to all of the big questions, what currency would a separate Scotland use? What would be the position in NATO? What would be the position in the European Union? They have not been able to provide a single credible answer.
Dr. Matthew Offord. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that while it is acceptable to hold opposing opinions, it is not acceptable to promote boycotts of goods produced in Israel or kosher goods, as this conflates the policies of the Israeli government with Judaism and also, in turn, leads to a rise in anti-Semitism? What reassurance can the Prime Minister give my constituents that this government will address both boycotts and anti-Semitism in the United Kingdom?
Well, we have been very clear that we don't support boycotts and we don't support measures that are intended to delegitimise the State of Israel, which has a right to exist and we argue has a right to peace within its proper borders. And I do think he makes an important point, which is we should be absolutely clear that you can criticise Israel and the Israeli government for its actions without being anti-Semitic. But what we have seen in recent weeks is a rise in anti-Semitic attacks in our country, and as I said on Monday, that is completely unacceptable.
Dr. Alistair MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And could I refer the Prime Minister to events in Rotherham? Does the Prime Minister agree that a common thread in the awful picture from Rotherham that has been referred to earlier and the dreadful plight of Aisha King this week is that the relevant authorities can all too often be driven by considerations other than the best interests of the child. And to reflect this sad lesson for all of us, will he agree to amend the Modern Slavery Bill to provide for independent child guardians who would be charged with reflecting the best interests of the child to all the relevant authorities and services?
I'm very proud of the fact that this government is introducing the Modern Slavery Bill. It's a bill I strongly support, and I'll look very carefully at the specific suggestion that he makes. Let me just make a brief comment on the other points that he makes. I think that, to be fair to the authorities involved in the case of Aisha King, they all want to do the best for the child. That is what they're thinking of, but I think what happened was that decisions were taken that weren't correct and didn't chime with a sense of common sense, and that, fortunately, has been put right. And what all of us in public life and public offices have to do is examine what the legal requirements are, but also make a judgment, and those judgments can sometimes be all-important.
Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If even the respected Hampshire police can use the European arrest warrant to create an injustice, can my right honourable friend have any confidence that other member states with less well-developed legal systems will not use the arrest warrant for worse purposes in future?
What I'd say to my honourable friend, and I respect his arguments, is, look, police they have to make their judgments, and as I've just said, they don't always get those judgments right. The question we have to ask ourselves in this House is we have to think about a situation potentially where a terrorist has attacked our country and is on the run through Europe to other countries, and how quickly we want to be able to get that person back in front of our courts to face British justice. Now, this is not an imaginary set of circumstances. This is exactly what happened in 2005 after the dreadful London bombing. So we do need to think about this. I am all for making sure that powers flow from Brussels to London, and they have in the case of Justice and Home Affairs, where we have repatriated over 100 measures. But I also want to be a Prime Minister who can look the British people in the eye and say we will keep you safe from serious crime, from terrorism, and we'll have people back in front of British courts as soon as possible.
Mr. Lindsay Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, we now know that in the event of separation, Scotland would no longer... That was a good laugh. Would no longer have a formal currency with the rest of the UK. In response, the First Minister has said that an independent Scotland would default on its share of the national debt. Prime Minister, what would be the consequences of such a reckless approach for the people of Scotland?
I think it is one of the most chilling things that has been said in this referendum campaign that a separate Scotland would consider defaulting on its debts. We all know what happens if you don't pay your debts. No one will lend you any money unless you pay a punitive interest rate. And we all know what that means for homeowners: much, much higher mortgage rates. For businesses, crippling interest rates. Those are the consequences of what the separatists are proposing, and we need to get that message out loud and clear in the coming days.
Sir Edward Lee!
For all the reasons that have been given, if we were to lose the Union, that would not only be a disaster for Scotland, but a national humiliation of catastrophic proportions. But may I just say gently to the Free Party leaders that perhaps we have been a bit complacent up to now, so may I urge them, in the next 2 weeks, to drop everything else and to stand shoulder to shoulder to fight for the union that we love and believe in.
No, I think my honourable friend is absolutely...
Order, just before the Prime Minister answers. Mr McNeill, you are a thoroughly decent chap, but you're a very overexcitable individual. You should calm down. You aspire to be a statesman. Try behaving like one. The Prime Minister.
I agree with my honourable friend about the importance of this referendum. What I would say to him is that I think the leaders of the parties in this House have all put aside their differences and said, in spite of the political differences we have, we all agree about one thing. Not just that Scotland is better off inside the United Kingdom, but the United Kingdom is better off with Scotland inside. And perhaps, as well as being leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister, as the Member of Parliament for an English seat, I say on behalf of everyone in England, and I believe in Wales and Northern Ireland, we want Scotland to stay.
Jim Shannon. But you want to be.
Prime Minister, we were all very aware of your interest in the Middle East and in particular Iraq. Looking at what has happened since we were last here for PMQs, and in particular the last 24 hours. At Mosul and in the plains of Nineveh in Iraq, Christians have been displaced, they have been threatened with beheading, they have been told convert or die. Is it not now time to consider further supportive action for Christians and additional sanctions against ISIL?
I think we should do everything we can to protect persecuted minorities, including Christians, but also the Yazidi communities, and that is where we've been using our resources. Up to now, that has mostly been humanitarian aid, which we've been delivering through our military assets, through RAF planes, working with others to make sure they're protected. But we should also, as part of that strategy, work with the Kurds and others so that ISIL can be beaten back and that Christians and others aren't persecuted.
Mr. John Hemming.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Increasing numbers of British families are leaving the UK, like the Asher King family, because they believe they will get a fairer trial in the family courts abroad rather than the family courts here. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that Parliament should look at the reasons for this?
We do regularly debate in this House family law. This government has made some amendments to family law after long debates within government and in this House. And if he's arguing that there should be further parliamentary opportunities, of course there are backbench days and other opportunities to raise these issues.
Carl Turner.
Given the birthday present given to him from the member for Clacton, how many more birthday surprises is he expecting from his Tory backbenchers?
I'm sure I'll be getting all sorts of pleasant surprises on my birthday, and please don't spoil it by letting me know what they are.
Mr. Speaker, Scotland is important to many businesses in Fylde, and many are rightly concerned that Alex Salmond and the Yes campaign have failed to provide a plan B on the issue of currency should Scotland become independent. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the voters of Scotland need to know what plan B is before they vote, and if they cannot get a clear answer, they should say no thanks to separation on the 18th September?
I think my honourable friend makes a good point, which is those of us who believe in the United Kingdom, we can answer all of these questions. We can answer what that United Kingdom will look like in the future. Those arguing for separation have not answered these questions, and their most recent effort to say that somehow Scotland would go on using sterling but not be part of a monetary union got a rebuff yesterday from the European Commissioner, who said that on that basis they wouldn't be able to be members of the European Union. So yet again, another piece of the puzzle completely falls away.
Mr. Peter Hain.
Mr. Speaker, but isn't the truth that ISIL won't be beaten without airstrikes in Syria as well, and that means engaging, however unpalatable, with the Assad regime and Iran, as well as, of course, the Saudis, perhaps also a route to resolving the bitter and dangerous Shia Sunni conflicts in the region, because ultimately ISIS poses a bigger threat to the nations in the region than it does to us.
Well, I make 2 points to the right honourable gentleman, whose views on this I respect. First of all, I would argue that Assad's brutality has been one of the things that has helped to generate the appalling regime that ISIS represents. The second thing that I would say is, yes, of course, what we want to see, and we're consistent across the piece on this, is democratic governments that are pluralistic and represent all of their people taking place. So we want to see that in Iraq, which is why we support Prime Minister Abadi in his attempts to build an inclusive government, and we should support attempts in Syria to have a democratic transition to a regime that can represent everyone in Syria.
Chris Kelly.
Jihadi crimes committed in the name of the Islamic State are completely incompatible with the British way of life. So I welcome the plans announced by my right honourable friend to seize British passports from dual nationals and to remove rights of residency in the UK from foreign nationals known to have been fighting with ISIL in Iraq and Syria in order to keep such people from committing terrorist atrocities in the UK. What progress has the government made concerning jihadis with only British citizenship, who my constituents believe have forfeited their right to return to the UK, even though they may be rendered stateless if deprived of citizenship?
Well, first of all, let me pay tribute to my honourable friend for his great work representing the people of Dudley South for the last 4 years and all the work that he's done. I think he's absolutely right to say that people in Dudley South, indeed people across our country, take a basic view that if you leave this country, you travel to the heart of Iraq, you declare that you are in favour of some so-called Islamic State, and that is the country you want to be part of, that you should forfeit effectively your right to come back and live in Britain. That is what people feel, and they feel it deeply, and that is why it's right to look at how we can have legal powers, not just to strip dual nationals of their British citizenship, not just to exclude foreign nationals, but those British citizens that make those statements should be stopped from coming back to our country.
Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, my constituent Christian Nicholson is trapped in northern Iraq, unable to travel home. In light of the threat from ISIL, will the Prime Minister look at his case and see what more can be done to expedite his return home as soon as possible, including issuing new travel documents if necessary? Yes.
I'm very happy to look at the Honourable Lady's case, and I'm sure the Foreign Secretary will have been listening to that. And let me take this opportunity to commend the work that the Foreign Office officials do, often unthanked, supporting those who get stuck in different countries, and indeed supporting families whose loved ones have been taken hostage. Obviously, we're focused on Iraq today, but since I've been Prime Minister, there have been hostages taken in countries like Nigeria and Somalia. We often don't hear about that work because it's better to keep people's names and identities from the public. But I think it's very important that people know that when this happens, that meetings of COBRA are held. I take a personal interest in each and every one of these cases to work out what we can do to help their families, to help bring people home, and to resolve these dreadful, complex situations.
Mr. James Gray.
Chaos in Iraq and Syria, appalling events just passed in Gaza, Libya in some disturbance, the appalling illegal annexation of Crimea by President Putin. Yet this House had no proper opportunity to discuss these matters. Is it not time the Prime Minister allowed us a full and substantive, preferably two-day debate, and certainly before the House rises for the party conference recess, a full debate to discuss these matters?
No, I think my honourable friend is absolutely right. We live in a very troubled and difficult world with huge changes taking place. And he mentioned some of the specific areas. In consultation with the Leader of the House, there will be a full day's debate, I think as soon as next Wednesday, which will give honourable members the chance to speak about these issues, and I'm sure there will be other subsequent opportunities, perhaps, to look at some of the individual questions that he raises.
Sarah Champion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The horrific, vile and disgusting abuse suffered by children in my constituency should never have been allowed to happen. The victims have still not got the support they deserve, and the criminals are still on the streets. Child sexual exploitation is not only a Rotherham issue, it is a national issue. So when will the Prime Minister appoint the chair to his inquiry into child abuse so that no child will be let down by statutory agencies again?
Well, first of all, can I commend the Honourable Lady? I think she's absolutely right to speak as she does. This has affected not just Rotherham. Of course, there were the dreadful cases in Oxford, near to my constituency, of a very similar nature, with similar failings in the systems. As I've announced, the Home Secretary will be leading this committee of ministers to draw together the government's response, and the announcement of the person who will lead the broader child abuse inquiry will be made in the coming days. These are all absolutely vital. I think we have to ask ourselves a series of questions about how these individual services failed. Yes, of course, there's the issue about whether these problems were ignored because of concerns about racism and political correctness, but I also think there is a big concern that sometimes the police and other agencies were ignoring these people because they somehow felt they were beyond the pale. And I think that offends all our senses of human decency, that none of these children, none of these young people should be ignored or left behind by our society.
Last but not least, Sir Mingus Campbell.
May I take my right honourable friend back to the issue of hostages? My right honourable friend will be aware that often when these cases arise, there's a suggestion that ransom should be paid. Should those who have advanced that case take account of the fact that money achieved by ransom is not distributed, for example, among the impoverished citizens of Gaza. Rather, it is used to purchase weapons, to finance the training and maintenance of those who are willing to use them, and otherwise to advance the malevolent objectives of terrorism.
I have to say, my right honourable friend is absolutely 100% right. There's no doubt in my mind that the many tens of millions of dollars that ISIL have raised from ransom payments is going into promoting terrorism, including terrorism affecting our own country. At the G8, I launched an initiative to try to get other countries to sign up to a very clear doctrine that in the case of terrorist kidnap, no ransom should be paid. Britain continues with this policy, America continues with this policy, but we need to redouble the efforts to make sure that other countries are good to their word.
Order. Order.